This training is part of Brownwood ISD's mandatory trainings for the beginning of the year. Throughout this training, you will learn more about the requirements for 504 and special education services and supports for students in Brownwood ISD. Please know that information in this presentation is critically important and may have legal implications for supporting students receiving services. In the Office of Special Populations, we believe that all students are general education students. We believe that every decision must be individualized. We believe in a shared responsibility for all students is essential for student success, and we recognize and act on the power of high expectations. It's important to understand the difference in the regulations and laws which ensure that all students with disabilities receive a free and appropriate public education. ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, is a civil rights law that prohibits the discrimination solely on the basis of disability in employment, public services, and accommodations. IDEA is an education act that provides federal financial assistance to state and local education agencies to guarantee special education and related services to eligible children with disabilities. IDEA requires public schools to find and evaluate students with disabilities at no cost to families. Students have a right to a free and appropriate public education, or FAPE, through an individualized education plan. The IEP is tailored to each student's unique needs. Section 504 is a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in programs and activities, both public and private, that receive federal financial assistance. People with disabilities have the right to reasonable accommodations, giving them equal access to learning and access to school activities. Schools don't need to change their programs, we just need to make sure that it's accessible to all students. Section 504 provides a broad spectrum of protections against discrimination based on disability, including accommodations for students in the classroom setting who qualify for those supports and services. Remember, Section 504 is a civil rights law, not educational reform. All qualified elementary and secondary public school students who meet the definition of an individual with a disability under Section 504 are entitled to receive regular or special education and related aids and services that are specifically designed to meet their individual educational needs as adequately as the needs of students without disabilities are met. A student under Section 504 is an individual with a disability who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity, has a record of such an impairment, or is regarded as having such an impairment. Here's a list of major life activities under Section 504, and again, this list is not exhaustive. School staff must also consider how the impairment affects any major life activity of the student and, if necessary, assess what is needed to ensure that students have an equal opportunity to participate in the school's program. Here are some examples of some 504 evaluations that may be necessary when we are looking at disabilities for students. In looking at the Section 504 meeting, here's who should attend the meeting. Needs to be somebody who can make placement decisions, has knowledge about the student, and can interpret the meaning of the evaluation data. So when do we hold the meetings? We would have an initial 504 for a student who we are bringing into the program, and every year we have an annual meeting, and then additionally we would have a manifestation determination review for students that we are considering removal from the home campus to DAEP. Accommodations must be created based on the impact of the impairment of each student's ability to access the general education environment. Accommodations should address all impacted areas of the student school environment, such as classroom testing, state and district assessments, and their behavior as well. Here are some examples and non-examples of some accommodations. When we are looking at writing accommodations in the 504 paperwork, we need to make sure that they are specific to the student needs and specific in explaining the accommodations. The Parent and Educator Resource Guide is our guiding document for Section 504 in public schools. Now we're going to switch our focus from 504 to look at special education support services. Special education is tailored to meet the needs of students with disabilities. The services and supports one child receives may be very different from what another child receives. It's all about individualization. What's important is giving the students the resources they need to make progress in school. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to special education. It's tailored to meet each student's specific individualized needs. Special education refers to a range of services that can be provided in different ways and in different settings. Special education today is focused on helping children with disabilities learn, but this is no longer meaning that we place students in a separate classroom all day long. In fact, federal law requires that students who receive special education services be taught alongside their non-disabled peers as much as possible. Here's a list of terms that you may come across as you engage through the special education process. And here's a list of disability conditions under special education in the state of Texas. We are legally obligated to ensure that students are provided services in the least restrictive environment, or the LRE. LRE is part of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. IDEA says that children who receive special education should learn in their least restrictive environment. This means they should spend as much time as possible with peers who do not receive special education. IDEA says two things about LRE that are important to understand when working with the ARD committee. The child should be with students in the general education to the maximum extent that is appropriate. Special education classes, separate schools, or removal from the general education class should only happen when students' thinking or learning difference, a disability under IDEA, is so severe that the supplementary aids and services provided to the student are not allowing for the student to make progress in the curriculum. Again, the key word here is appropriate. In a nutshell, FAPE, or a free appropriate public education, is an individualized education plan that is designed to meet the student's unique needs from which the student receives educational benefit and prepares them for further education, employment, and independent living. Special education supports and services are not defined by a location. Special education is a service. Our goal for students is to close the gap between the student's current level of functioning, where the student is expected to function academically on grade level. The ARD committee is required to revise the IEP as appropriate to address a lack of expected progress toward annual goals and other matters such as attendance, discipline, and behavior needs. General education team members should come to the ARD committee meeting prepared to discuss student strengths in the classroom as well as where the student tends to be struggling. Remember that all decisions are based on data and is not determined by our opinions. Please ensure that you provide the ARD committee all relevant data for consideration as decisions are made about accommodations and placement based on this data. Teacher input forms are critical for our development for consideration by the committee members. Do not write opinions in this document. Keep all information based on the data that you have collected in the classroom. The information in this document is our baseline for present levels of performance, and this is what we build our students' goals from. Please bring work samples and be ready, willing, and able to discuss how the student is currently doing in your classroom. We have some common expectations for our art committee meetings across the district, and these expectations should be abided by to ensure a true collaborative meeting focused on the student. Be present and fully engaged in the conversation, leaving all technology for only accessing information for the art committee to consider. Instructional accommodations are intended to reduce or eliminate the effects of the student's disability on academic tasks, but they do not lower learning expectations. Some of these may include accommodations to how we're presenting to students or how they are responding, the timing and scheduling or the setting. Curricular modifications change what the student is expected to master. Modifications typically require a student to learn less material or learn material below grade level. The decision to modify is a significant one and should be driven by data individualized for each student. Art committee should keep in mind that using modifications may have adverse implications, as students accessing below grade level content may not close achievement gaps. Additionally, modifying a student's curriculum can also impact their post-secondary options. According to state and federal law, all instructional staff, including elective courses and special education teachers, as well as general education teachers, must provide the accommodations identified in the student's IEP or Section 504 plan. Teachers can be held legally liable for failure to implement and document classroom accommodations. Under new legislation requirements, parents now have the right to file due process for up to 2 years. This means that we as educators must keep our documentation readily available for 2 years, and this includes any of the samples listed on this slide. Documentation of students, supports, and services through 504 and special education is critical. Remember, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. We are required to review data and documentation as we make decisions for students. Additionally, parents have the right to request to review documentation of IEP implementation. IEP accommodations, behavior intervention plans, and other critical information for students will be found in AWARE. Your campus special education teachers and support staff can assist you in locating these accommodations. Additionally, they are there to support you in understanding what an accommodation looks like in your classroom and offer suggestions for documentation for accommodation use and/or refusal. So the purpose of special education is to specially design instruction for students who qualify under special education umbrella. This means that we adapt the content, methodology, or delivery of instruction to address the unique needs of the student that is based on that student's disability. Specially designed instruction under special education means to intentionally design instruction on where the student is currently functioning. So we're addressing the gaps where the student is. And the instruction should be designed based on the vertical alignment of the TEKS and scaffolding those skills to make sure that we're reaching those students' goals. Now that we've talked a little bit about instruction, let's visit about a student's least restrictive environment, or LRE. To ensure that we have a common understanding of our language, inclusion is a belief system. Least restrictive environment is a setting where the student is educated to the maximum extent appropriate with their non-disabled peers. We are required by law to ensure that each student receives supports and services in his or her least restrictive environment to ensure meaningful access to the general curriculum. All students who receive special education services are general education students. They just happen to receive additional supports and services through special education. The ARD committee must always consider the general education environment first. Here's a visual of the continuum of services for students who receive special education. Remember, special education is not a place. It's not a room at the end of the hallway where students with disabilities are educated separately from their peers. It's a service or services provided in a variety of ways and settings based on the student's individual needs. One of the components of the IDEA is the expectation that students with IEP should be educated alongside their non-disabled peers in the gen ed classroom as much as possible or as much as appropriate, which is referred to the least restrictive environment for that student. IDEA requires to the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities, including children in public or private institutions, are educated with children who are non-disabled. So any placement outside the gen ed classroom must be justified, and it has to be based on that student's disability-related needs. Placement outside the gen ed classroom is not taken lightly and is always based on data-driven decisions. All evaluations for dyslexia are through an individual evaluation. The ARD committee determines if the student requires specially designed instruction for dyslexia or requires standard dyslexia protocol. So dyslexia is characterized by difficulties with accurate and/or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of the language, is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. So as we work to break down some of the myths of dyslexia, here are a few that we commonly hear. All students in Brownwood ISD dyslexia programs are monitored for progress as they complete the dyslexia program. Some common characteristics of dyslexia include difficulty with phonological awareness, rapid naming, reading words in isolation, and also difficulty in learning to spell. Students with dyslexia may have some of these common difficulties in the classroom. Planned, purposeful instructional tasks that are systematic and grounded in research is really key in helping students with dyslexia in the classroom. These strategies include direct instruction in phonics, repetition, and using a multi-sensory delivery for instruction and using sounds, naming, music, and rhyming. Engaging students in this multidisciplinary or multisensory instructional approach is critical as it engages two or more pathways in the brain simultaneously in order to enhance memory and learning. Brownwood ISD has a process for ensuring our compliance with Child Find and ensuring students with disabilities are found and provided services in the schools. Contact your campus diagnostician, campus administration, or RTI coordinator at your campus for more information. Brownwood ISD is committed to ensure that students with disabilities are fully supported in the classroom and in the community. We are legally obligated to ensure that we abide by all Child Find timelines and seek consent no later than 15 days after the date of the parent request for evaluation. This request can be verbal or in writing. Of course, we always would like to have it in writing to be able to track our timelines. Do not wait to contact your child find coordinator to let them know if you have a parent request. That needs to be done immediately. If you're concerned about a student's progress, you may want to reach out to the RTI specialist, campus administrator, or your special education instructional facilitator. Remember that not all students who struggle academically or behaviorally have a disability, and we can help brainstorm options for supporting in Tier 1 and Tier 2 through response to intervention. Our next section is extremely important as we are also legally required to document, track, and reflect on students' use of timeout in our child safety holds or restraints. A child safety hold or restraint of a student with a disability may be only used in a clearly defined emergency situation. Schools must inform parents when it becomes necessary to use a restraint in an effort to protect the student, other students, or prevent serious property damage. An emergency means a situation in which a student's behavior poses a threat of imminent, serious physical harm to the student or others, and imminent, serious property destruction. If students are able to be removed from the location of the student in distress and not in danger, a restraint may not be necessary. Additionally, if a student is on the floor and other students are not in danger, a restraint may not be warranted. Restraint means the use of physical force or a mechanical device to significantly restrict the free movement of all or a portion of the student's body. Restraint must be limited to the use of such reasonable force as it is necessary to address the emergency. And the restraint must be discontinued at the point in which the emergency no longer exists. So, for example, if a student is in a restraint and the student drops to the floor, you immediately release the restraint. And a restraint must be implemented in such a way as to protect the health and safety of the student and others, and it must not deprive the student of basic human necessities. It's really important to remember that we ensure the dignity of the student who is being restrained and that dignity is maintained. No discipline management practice may be calculated to inflict injury, cause harm, demean, or deprive the student of basic human necessities. Actions such as holding a student's hand while walking or hand-over-hand assistance is not considered a restraint. When in doubt, go back to the definition of a restraint, and if you are still unsure, contact the Director of Special Populations for assistance. Brownwood ISD is legally required to ensure that we follow the necessary actions outlined in regulations for notifying parents when a restraint is used. Again, if you are not sure, contact the Director of Special Populations and we will walk you through that process. On the day of the restraint, the campus administrator or designee must be notified, the parent must be notified, and the student must be seen by the nurse before going home. Written documentation regarding the use of the restraint must be placed in the student's special education eligibility folder, so the ARD committee may consider the impact of the student's behavior on the student learning, and if we have to, also look at the creation or revision of a behavior intervention plan. Anyone who restrains a student must receive training within 30 school days if they have not previously been trained. This is Brownwood ISD's restraint flowchart, and it's located in the Special Populations Handbook for campus administrators and staff to reference. I'm going to talk a few minutes about timeout. Timeout means a behavior management technique in which that we provide a student with an opportunity to regain self-control, and the child is separated from other children for a limited period of time. That location is not locked, and the student is able to exit, meaning it's not blocked by furniture or held by a staff member from the outside. Timeout must be documented in the student's IEP or the behavior intervention plan and must be documented for tracking use and reflected upon at the student's ARD meeting. For students who have a BIB, schools will be required to document each time a student uses timeout when it's prompted by a behavior of the student specified in the student's plan. And also, it needs to include a description of the behavior that prompted the use of timeout. And remember, if you ask a student to sit in the hallway, this is considered a timeout because they are being removed from instruction. Timeout must be documented every time. Documentation or data collection regarding the use of timeout, if any, must be addressed in the IEP, and the ARD committee must use any of this collected data to judge the effectiveness of the intervention, and we have to make adjustments as necessary. Just a reminder that by law, you must document every time a student uses timeout. Use of timeout must not be implemented in a fashion that precludes the ability of the student to be involved in progress in the general curriculum. Timeout must be included in the student's IEP, and if it is used on a recurrent basis, we need to look at that target behavior and address accordingly. If you have a student who requires documentation on use of timeout, you will need to track the student's time in and time out. The documentation must be kept and reviewed at the student's annual ARD meeting. The use of seclusion in the state of Texas is illegal and will not be used in Brownwood ISD. Seclusion means a behavior management technique in which the student is confined in a locked box, closet, or locked in a room that's designed solely to seclude a person and it contains less than 50 square feet of space. Under no circumstances should a student be in a room by himself or herself with the door being held shut or locked from the outside. This includes the door being held shut by a staff member. When transporting a student in crisis, you should use a low, medium, level standing hold position only. In no case should you carry a student. When the student is not actively engaged in walking, the transport stops immediately. If the student drops to the ground, the restraint stops. You can sit by the student if you need to. Documentation is still required. This does not include holding the hand of a student when walking or transporting a student from one location to another. The key is to know your students. Every student on the autism spectrum is unique, and they all have different triggers that can contribute to behaviors. Our job is to know our students and identify those triggers so we can better learn to prevent behaviors and de-escalate them as quickly as possible. Ensure that you have access to and follow the behavior intervention plan, and at the first signs of escalation, you should be thinking through the crisis matrix and escalation techniques. For our students with autism who are already escalated, some triggers may include transitions, eye contact, sensory overload, and having an audience. If you can remove these triggers, it is very beneficial in helping de-escalate the student. Allow students time to process the situation. Remember, less is more when attempting to communicate with students in crisis. Don't try to engage verbally until the student is ready, and use nonverbal communication when attempting to de-escalate. The Office of Special Populations is committed to ensuring that our parents are partners in their child's education, as well as ensuring that staff is supported and have the tools to support students with disabilities in the classroom. You can contact your campus special education staff, diagnostician, or our office for any assistance.